thank you all for coming. It's a beautiful day. Well, today's Dhamma talk is something that I've been pondering and trying to digest what's been going on in the world during the past 2.5, 3 weeks especially. Whether it was the incidents in Paris, Lebanon, Syria, Mali, other parts of the world. As a Buddhist, as a Buddhist Dhamma instructor, teacher, whatever you want to call it, we cannot disassociate ourselves from the pains and the suffering and the drives that individuals have that compel them, in a sense, to go ahead and commit certain acts. So it's very difficult to, it's a complex issue. We always want to adhere to black and white. This is evil, this is good, etc. Fortunately, we have wholesome and unwholesome acts, thoughts, and speech that we learn from Buddhism that can give us some type of a leeway, some type of a forum for us to kind of put things in perspective. So today's Dhamma talk will involve intentions, the defilements, jokes, a little bit of a playfulness, killing, and the mind. There's two things that are so crucial for life, as being a life that actually brings about a sense of happiness and joy. Two things that are important for us to understand and to approach everything that we experience. One is that the fact that we have objects. And as far as we human beings are concerned, there's 6 objects that we need to be aware of. Objects including visual perception, auditory perception, tactile, physical, gustatory, taste, olfactory, smelling. I might be missing one, but there's also the mind. The mind, meaning the mental objects that we perceive, thoughts, concepts, memories, things that we process. And then there is the mind that observes everything. In meditation, we are taught to actually observe the objective world, things that makes us living, in fact. Life comes through us through the objective experience. Oftentimes, if not throughout life, we always find ourselves in a position where we want to change the objective world. How this cushion feels, how the armrest on the chairs actually might be a little bit too rigid, too tough for the elbows to experience a sense of comfort. The actions of another, the unfairness of other people, how they treat others. Socioeconomic issues, sociocultural issues, religious issues, etc. There's this thing called laziness that removes us from that sense of responsibility that is necessary, in fact, in the life of a person who is striving to become mindful throughout their days. It's so easy for us to go back and just rely on the words of another, the words of tradition, the words that they might have heard through hearsay. there's a wonderful sutta called Kalama Sutta that in both traditions, in Mahayana and Theravada, we are at least required to know, because it brings down into a very palatable way the teachings of the Buddha, the core teachings of the Buddha. And there's several things that the Buddha warns individuals against, in a sense, because the question arises when they invite the Buddha over, the Kalama, villagers of Kalama invite the Buddha to speak to them, because apparently in this time period, in this village, there have been many Brahmins and teachers who had gone by this village, and apparently they were a very sophisticated group of people at that time. So many philosophers, many individual teachers had gone by and taught them different principles. However, the common denominator between all of them had been, at the end of their sermons or lectures, they would always say that this is the correct, the most absolute correct teaching that you need to adhere to, abide by, in order for you to, for example, to be saved. So they were perplexed, and they raised the question to the Buddha, asking him, we're confused. We have a dilemma. We don't know which one's correct, in fact. Which one is the one that we need to really, really hold on to. And the Buddha's first words to them is, your dilemma is absolutely understandable. He validates their confusion. And then he gives a list of about 10 different categories which we humans adhere to, we subscribe to, in order for us to put ourselves in line with a certain teaching, a philosophy, or a way of us accepting things to be true, capital T. And if you narrow down to those 10 things, you come down to beliefs, whether it's revelation, whether it's, again, hearsay, things that you've overheard, or things that you actually begin to subscribe to simply because of the authority or title or the followers of a certain individual, teacher, and the other being your own intellectual capacity to process and to reason out certain things. They both, when you look at them separately, and you look at the religious traditions, ways of thinking that humanity has come up with over millennia, you see that at one point or another they separate the individual from the experience of truth, reality, objective world. We always like to put our own schmear, our own layer, as it were, our own filter on the natural world. We try to make sense of the world around us, try to control. So that's another word that I would like us to ponder. Control. You know, we change our clothing in the same way many of us change religions, ideologies, relationships, new ways, new goals for us to really follow and get to somewhere. This utopian respite. And I invite you to ask or question the validity of such a thing. Nothing is waiting for us in the next moment. Nothing is waiting for us in the future. That statement puts a tremendous sense of responsibility in our laps. It gives us a sense of maturity. It gives us a sense of Okay, it's all on me now. Where does that leave tradition? Where does that leave what the Buddha said, what Muhammad said, what Jesus said? Where does that leave all the scriptures, all the things that we've kept hearing about throughout different cultures, teachings? So what seems to be lacking in today's world is a sense of relinquishment of one's own responsibility and blaming it, not blaming it necessarily all the time, however, giving the responsibility, handing it over to a tradition, to the elders, to a sect, to a way of belief, etc., etc. And now, if you can, juxtapose that with what we were looking at earlier, which was objects and the mind. Objects in this case are not necessarily tangible things all the time. They, as I said earlier, mind, the mental objects, rather, concepts, are objects within this tradition. Touch, feelings, sounds, sights, touches, etc., all these things are objects, meaning all that constitutes a life, living experience, which is like the capsule of the present moment. In order for us to be living, we need to be exposed to all those elements. Now, I want to relay to you a scene I just witnessed as I was coming to the temple for this talk. I was passing by an affluent part of Pasadena. Just before I entered the freeway, I saw two, what seemed to me, two Caucasian gentlemen who seemed to be somewhat in their 60s, if not older, and they were driving two, each of them, luxurious cars. However, one tried to overtake the other car, and they were visibly upset at each other. You can almost hear the anger from their expression of the way they looked and the way they drove. Makes you wonder, doesn't it, whether anger, delusion, greed has any color, has any passports, specific ones, has a religion, has a tenet, has a belief system. So what I encourage you to look at is defilements. In Buddhism we call them defilements, or the three poisons. Greed, which comes in the form of lust, attachment, and aversion, which is anger, and ignorance, or delusion, which is the mother of both. A lack of mindfulness, a lack of awareness, that is like the foundation of both. They don't need a citizenship in any particular country. They don't need a race, they don't need a gender, they don't need or have a passport, a language. They're not necessarily Muslim, they're not necessarily Buddhist, they're not necessarily Christian or whatever. So where does that leave us vis-a-vis what's been happening in Paris, for example? Paris, or recently other parts of the world, they've been raging with all these issues that have been happening. For 2 weeks, I've been, when I said earlier that I've been trying to digest as to how to approach this topic. Because the terror attacks have affected us, all of us, in one way or the other. And I was debating whether I should even make that a subject for our Dhamma talk today. However, it's like the elephant in the room if we do not discuss it. We're living in a world where we are in everybody else's business, in a sense. There's so many of us. Certain ideologies have to be revisited. They don't belong in 21st century. We all know that. However, to impose our own views on a different religious practitioners and say, you're wrong, and we are going to change that, that is not necessarily the healthiest way of doing it. That needs to come from within that particular tradition itself. They have the authority to do that, but they themselves have to really have the courage to do that. Well, where does that courage come from? Information, data, and courageous living, which brings us back to mindful living. Using the mind to observe everything that one experiences in life. I was recently watching a YouTube video of this particular monk, a Buddhist monk in Myanmar, who was, on the cover of, I believe it was Times or People I think it was Times magazine, where he actually called himself the Buddhist Bin Laden. And you smile. You just it's there's such a dichotomy there between the teachings of the Buddha and such a statement. And obviously, when he says that, there's tremendous history behind that in one's own standing, and in fact, you could have even seen it on his face. When was the last time you actually saw the picture of a person who terrorizes someone who is truly happy, who's just heard a joke? You cannot hurt someone if you're happy, if you're joyful, if you just are telling a joke. Imagine two people are about to kill each other. Tell them a joke. They will stop. They cannot continue on their murderous act. It's impossible. It's wonderful, in fact. So I think a lot of people need to hear jokes. I mean, I bet that those groups of people who went into those planes, I think it was 19 or 18 of them, who came from very affluent countries, Saudi, UAE and other places, and some of them had PhDs, who went into these planes and slit the throats of the flight attendants and were responsible for so many atrocities. If they had heard some jokes, what would the outcome of those things would have been? Would they have still gone through it? Now, we might be in some way, I don't want to trivialize the acts in any way, shape, or form. However, the seriousness of the mind in pursuing this non-existent next moment that is completely based on some hearsay or some tradition that says you will, if you commit this, you will be in a much better place in the next moment. And in this example, it's heaven with, for example, 72 virgins. You've heard of this. That might be true, might not be true. However, this is true. This action, this moment, this present moment is true. The only thing we have control over. And that brings us to the next keyword that I mentioned earlier, control. Seeking of control. What can we control? Is there such a thing that we can truly control? We can't even control a single cell in our bodies. Truly control it. However, we can be mindful of whatever is occurring in the body and through these 6 sense doors coming in. And our behavior towards them, our attitude, our right view. Do we have right view or do we not? And how do we know if there is right view or wrong view? The litmus test for that is basically the three poisons. Knowing if there's greed or attachment, if there's anger in any of the decisions we're about to make, or words that we're about to utter, or whether we are mindful of what we're about to do, meaning the lack of delusion, which is the third defilement. Now you are brought back to that word, responsibility. Responsibility is something we seek to move away from when we're quietly sitting on our own and thinking about things that would or might happen in the next moment, meaning not now. Relying on the future, or trying to control the behaviors of others around us. So basically what I'm trying to share with you are a set of questions to ask ourselves. I was asking as I was driving here today, myself, where those individuals who blew themselves up this couple of weeks ago in Paris, and the people that they've harmed. First of all, it's impossible for you to be present. It just goes against your DNA. No matter how much of a strong belief you are, it goes against your DNA, doing those last flickers of moments, those tiny little compartments of thousands and thousands of milliseconds, where you close your eyes because you know you're about to kill yourself. If they were able to see their own loved ones, their own children being there, and someone else doing it, their own loved ones, their own wives, their own sisters, their own mothers, being exposed to those bullets or those bombs or whatever they use to kill these people. What would their actions have been like? Would they have stopped? That moment, if it was lived mindfully, it's impossible for one person to kill another. Ultimately, we're getting to that point where we are actually forced to, as I was mentioning earlier, living in each other's faces, in each other's spaces. So there seems to be a necessity, a requirement for us to come out of the norm and just say, okay, and start asking. Start asking the validity of where we're coming from. And when I was a child, I was about 8. My parents took me to a place near my aunt's house. It was near a village, and they had overheard that there had been killings, mass killings. I was born and raised in Beirut. I was there for a significant amount of time. So I was about 8, and they told me, the whole community knew of people being massacred, both Muslims being massacred and Christians. And I was just following along, and everybody was curious, and I remember a group of us, we started walking up this hill, and we got to a place that before even I turned the corner, and it was surrounded by pine trees, Mediterranean pine trees. They're beautiful, the pine trees. And as we turned the corner, I cannot forget this image of a pile, and there was still smoke coming out, and this incredible stench, which I cannot remove from my mind. And I saw some horrific things. A pile of dead human beings. And that was a pile of human beings that used to be Muslims. People that had been picked up from roadblocks that Christians controlled. And you had all kinds of individuals there in that pile. One segment of that memory involves a tiny little teddy bear that still had smoke coming out of it. What the remnants of a teddy bear, anyhow. And I was traumatized by that, as my family was. Now, we also heard that the fact that that same incident that was happening actually in different parts of Lebanon. This was in the 70s, around 78, 1978. And the Muslims had been doing the same thing. Christians were doing the same thing. So each one was blinding the eyes of the other. And years later, I'm giving a Dhamma talk and we're sharing these thoughts, and human nature is very complex. However, it comes down to one thing. How much of a responsible action is it that we are committing? And who are we subscribing? What ideology are we subscribing to? And where is our sense of awareness in all of this? Is it present even? So I'm leaving you with a bunch of questions here. I know that. Recently, we've even had something quite unthinkable, in at least to my measures, of a Buddhist monk, a Theravada monk, promoting one single monk, by the way. We have to make sure we put that out there, because the same individuals, the Muslim community within Myanmar, the following day, they were protected by other monks completely. They were taken in, over 1,000 of them, into a monastery within Myanmar, protected by Buddhist monks from these rogue, I would say, rogue community of individuals. And what the Kalama Sutta here has to say about that is, do not follow a tradition blindly. Do not follow even your reasoning. Well, they did this to me, so I should be allowed to do that to them. Sometimes logic has the same devastating effect as blind faith. And that's why the Kalama Sutta is trying to indicate we need to transcend both. And just have a lighter touch. Have a lighter touch on every single moment that we live. On the outside we are so very well trimmed and proper and civilized and sophisticated and cultured, etc. We use the right words. However, we are sitting on a cesspool of defilements. And given the fact that we are in everyone else's, especially a community like Los Angeles, a place where there's so many cultures coming together, so many thoughts and ideologies coming together. And now you superimpose that onto the world scene, and you see how those of us who still hold on to beliefs without questioning, how is this going to affect my neighbor? My neighbor who does not have the same beliefs, who might not be coming from the same cultural background. How will that affect them, their family members? And that brings us to the word cowardice. Not living in the moment is one very good example of living cowardly. A courageous person does not have anything other than the moment. Living in the moment, irrespective of what will happen in the future. And if they are living fully in that moment, they cannot become deluded. You cannot be angry. You cannot be angry. Anger comes because we are holding on to some concept of wanting things to be a certain way other than what they are, and wanting to change that. So a lighter touch allows us the space to think about other possibilities of joy, of happiness, of putting a smile on my neighbor's child's face, making them go happily to sleep. It's wonderful. You can bring paradise to you. You don't have to kill yourself cowardly, because it is a cowardly act. Whether you're a Buddhist committing it, whether you're a Muslim committing it, whether you're a Christian committing it, it is an act. And it does not rely on your religion. It relies on ignorance. We like to demonize the person. And in fact, in World War I, researchers and scientists and political or military leaders were confused because they noticed that the soldiers that were attacking each other, the ammunition that was being used, it was not congruent with the amount of casualties, meaning there were less people dying even though there was an enormous amount of ammunition being used on them. And then after a tremendous amount of questioning and researching, they found out that people were not comfortable killing other people. There was something odd about killing another human being. So what these soldiers, were doing was they were actually overshooting. They were avoiding the enemy. Literally, intentionally, they were doing that. And the military, the generals and all that, on both sides, they decided, okay, how can we actually fix the problem and get more people to be killed? They started using this methodology of separating those individuals, the enemy, as someone other than human, other than yourself, your kind, your color, your race, your whatever. And that same methodology has continued ever since. Whether it was in Vietnam, Korean War, World War II, Gulf War, and you name it. Here we have, in Los Angeles, we had in the past, gangs, etc. What do? You change the name, you change the character, you put a different veil on the person and package them differently, and now it becomes okay for you to actually wipe them out from the face of humanity. Removes yourself from putting the responsibility on yourself to face your defilements. Again, removing yourself from the present moment. And that is extremely important, because our responsibility, at least within the Buddhist tradition, is not to necessarily change the outside world. The responsibility is always on us to change ourselves. There's nothing more valuable, nothing more important in your life than experiencing joy. That tranquility of mind. Change yourself. Worry about that. Then the change in the world that you want to see happen, that will come. Because it's going to come out of this. This individual, here, living now. Not in 5 seconds. Now. Not in 5 seconds ago. Now. I've seen pain and suffering. I was born in Lebanon, Middle East, in the middle of the most tumultuous war that I could, fathom. And I personally was injured. Doctors said I wasn't going to make it. I lost parts of my body, my foot. So I am somewhat privy to what violence is and how it can change a human being. But the responsibility is still within the person. no matter what has happened to us, that should not give us the permission to go ahead and take away the opportunity of another human being. Again, the change that needs to occur has to come from the bosom of our own lives, personal lives. And that's where we bring it back to objects around us and the mindfulness, the mind that needs to process that, observe that. Moments lived mindfully cannot bring about hate, racism, killing, murder, you name it. It's a joyful state of being, living mindfully. And you cannot be mindful. That's another thing which I've observed in teachers that I've studied with, and friends and colleagues and meditators. Your facial muscles relax. There's a sense of ease around you. It's wonderful. So I invite you, every time you see yourself or a person who looks stern and mean or frustrated or angry, first have the compassion. And second, share with them a smile. Be generous with your smiles. It's very infectious. It's very appealing. It's very life-changing.